The topic for today is storytelling. And storytelling is a super interesting topic. It's something that applies in the world of copywriting and advertising, and certainly in presentations and public speaking. And it's something that I really emphasize, and I try to encourage many of my clients and students to incorporate into their presentations and their speeches, is to try to incorporate as many effective stories as possible. So let's start with this, Julie. I would love to just kind of get a broad sense of your approach to developing stories, interesting and engaging stories, whether in marketing copy or in other contexts. What's kind of like your approach to doing that?
I feel like it's kind of this hidden power that you can use, whether it is in writing or presenting or what have you. It's something that you can use to really influence people. To persuade people, to get them to do what you want them to do, which is exactly, my shtick in advertising and marketing, So storytelling is very compelling. You want to keep the audience engaged and entertained. You want to move them to action. And really, in your presentation, you want them to understand and support the ideas that you present. So I feel like, it's something that's so handy, yet so many people forget about. But if you can find a story that's relatable, I think that's really going to help you in the long run, no matter, in what scenario you're using it.
Yeah, I was doing a session with a client last night, and she's a VP in this real estate company. And so she's going to be giving a presentation at a quarterly luncheon in a couple months. And just in the course of practicing and rehearsal, some of her personal stories were coming out just organically. And talking about like when she first joined the company, talking about her professional relationship with some of her colleagues and her team members, some of the innovations and new processes that they're implementing. So all of this stuff just comes out organically, and it really livens up the presentation, and it makes it much more interesting and impactful than if it was just dry, straightforward information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Justin, I'm curious from your perspective as somebody who coaches, those who give presentations and whatnot, where do you recommend putting a story? Is it the beginning, the middle, the end? What are best practices when it comes to that?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is, first of all, the presentation in its entirety can be a story. Mm-hmm. So you can lead the audience through a journey from the beginning of your presentation all the way to the end. So that's kind of meta and high level, but in terms of the way you structure the overall information, that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it, which is probably more accessible for those that are more at the beginner level, is to take your normal information of the presentation and look for little pockets, little opportunities throughout where you can inject a personal story, for example. Something about yourself personally, how you came to this topic, what inspired you, or what your personal connection is to this particular project, or how you discovered the problem itself and how you went about starting to develop a solution, for example. Mm-hmm. Any kind of personal connection is really powerful because that enables the audience to put themselves in your shoes. Yeah. Right? And so when you're talking from your personal perspective or background, that creates a very engaging and powerful connection with the audience. So if you're at the beginner level and you're just starting to experiment with stories, that's what I would say is like start with your normal basic presentation, and maybe there's a moment at the beginning or somewhere around the middle where you could inject a little mini story. Mm-hmm. Or maybe somewhere towards the end where you can close with an interesting and exciting story. A great way to kind of wrap things up and leave the audience with a powerful message right at the end. And as you're getting more advanced, you can think on a more structural level how the entire presentation can be essentially a story or a journey for the audience.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Start small and then, grow as you go. I find that people are able to really understand the point that I'm trying to make when I'm personally giving presentations. And so I try and add in just little bits and pieces of my experience, that I've had in the past. And I've got to share for those of you who have never seen me speak before, one of my favorite stories that I love to include is essentially, talking about setting boundaries, which I think is applicable to anybody and everybody in whatever industry you're in. And, for me, let's say I'm talking about, setting boundaries with your friends, your family, your clients, what have you, especially if you're self-employed. And so I share this story about how I had to tell my mom that she cannot call me in the middle of the workday just to chit chat, because we all love her, but at the same point in time, like she doesn't have that boundary. She thinks I'm not working because I work from home, and so I had to set those boundaries and say, Mom, you can call me over the lunch hour, you can call me after work, or on the weekends. Please don't bother me during the day and expect me to take your call and just sit there for 45 minutes because, and here's where the kicker is, one time, and this is many years ago when I still had a home office line as well as my cell phone, she called 4 times in 2 minutes. 4 times and did not leave a message on either line. And so of course I'm thinking, oh my gosh, my dad's had some sort of health emergency, right? And so I pick up the phone right away and I call her back and I'm like, Mom, is everything okay? Yeah, it's fine. What are you doing? I was like, is Dad okay? Yeah, Dad's fine. What are you doing? Well, of course, Mom, I'm working, right? And she comes back and she goes, well, drop what you're doing. There's a meat sale at Price Chopper. I'm like, oh my God, at the local grocery store. And I'm like, really? So I love telling that story because I think so many people can relate, with some sort of overbearing mother or boss or, friend. Yeah. And, just something that adds in humor and relatability, right? And it brings it back to, it's a personal story that you can implement into your professional life as well.
Yep, absolutely. I love that. And that's, it's something that is relatable, like we said, it's so powerful to have that relatability. And also what you're doing there is there's emotions, which is a major concept that I always emphasize. It's one thing to deliver a story as a sequence of events or a sequence of happenings. It's another thing to actually take the audience through that emotional roller coaster, the ups and downs. So there's a concept, maybe you've heard of this, Julie, called the narrative arc. Are you familiar with that?
Well, not that term anyway. Go ahead and explain it.
So the narrative arc, it's one way of describing this phenomenon of essentially the roller coaster of emotions, the sequence of emotions and experiences, positive and negative or neutral, throughout the course of a story. It could be a movie, could be a book, whatever the medium is. And there's been a lot of interesting analysis actually around the concept of the narrative arc and which sequences of arcs, which sequences of emotions are most impactful to audiences. And it's a super interesting concept, way beyond the scope of what we can discuss here today. I'll share a link for more info on that, on a really interesting analysis from McKinsey and MIT researchers that they did on this particular concept. But essentially, it's recognizing that you can strategically dial up or down the emotions in your story to make things more intense or less intense, depending on the point that you're trying to get across in your professional presentation.
Yeah, I've definitely heard of, not that term, but that concept, kind of, presenting a challenge, sharing a journey, offering, some sort of resolution. Maybe, the subject becomes the hero, right, of the story. And anything that can really cause some sort of like physical response, chemical response, emotional response. I feel like all of that is really good in, building that suspense and then bringing it back to reality. Here's how this works, in your company, in your business, whatever it is that you're talking to.
Yeah, exactly. So for example, let's say I want to talk about the success that we've had with a particular project. I can start out my story or my presentation by talking about the problems and the challenges, thinking about the overall background and context, why this project was even started in the first place, right? So what were the problems that we were facing? Well, we had a slowdown in sales, user retention was going down, et cetera, et cetera. So this was the set of challenges that we were facing, right? So that, and I can convey the negative emotions, right, as I'm delivering that part of the story. So I can say, it was really frustrating. And I turn to my colleague and I say, this is really frustrating. I don't know how we're going to get out of this challenge, right? So I can convey that emotion strategically, right, to bring the audience with me as I'm opening this story. Then slowly I get into the solution. Here were the new initiatives that we developed. We spent a lot of late nights developing these ideas. I think Joe even slept under his desk one night, which was crazy, but I really admire his commitment to the project and his passion. And at the end, we were able to implement these amazing new developments. And that's what I want to share with you all here today, right? So I'm conveying those emotions associated with the solution to the problem. I've set the stage, I've set the background and the context, and then I've started to implement the solution. So it can become so much more engaging and so much more interesting than just reciting this information piece by piece.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for that emotional pull. And, you and I have talked about this before, that, you want to try and figure out what people's emotional pain points are, whether it's a potential client or you're giving a pitch, to your corporation, your office, what have you. There's something to be said for that. And I think if you can get people on the same wavelength where you're trying to get them to understand, maybe it's by using empathy, right? Something that will help invoke trust and understanding. I think just these personal stories are really going to help engage people. I think they're going to be more likely to listen to you. I mean, besides, it also adds color to your presentation, right? So it's not just boring numbers or whatever it is you're presenting on. But not only will it be more likely to have them listen to you, but also to take action afterwards. So not just, yes, I agree with you, but okay, let's go do something about it.
Yep, exactly. So emotions, vivid language, using that emotional language, and also demonstrating those emotions as you're going through the presentation. Thinking about a personal connection. And by the way, the personal connection can be your personal relation to this information or to the presentation, or it could be a third party. It could be your coworker, it could be maybe a member of the audience that you're speaking to. So you're presenting to the executive team, for example. Maybe there's one specific person in the room that has said something that is highly relevant to this story, or maybe you had a conversation recently with that person or with someone on the client side of your company. You can say, I was speaking a couple weeks ago with Jennifer on the client side, and she told me something really interesting about how they are using our product and blah, 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 right? You can kind of go into that little mini story as a way to set up the rest of the presentation. So the personal connection, the emotional and vivid language, thinking about all of the emotions and how you can stagger them or put them in a sequence to rope the audience in, keep them engaged all the way through. I'm curious, Julie, what some of the challenges or mistakes that you've seen copywriters make when it comes to storytelling, because I think there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of potentially valuable lessons that we can learn from those potential mistakes. So anything there that you've seen or observed, any kind of mistakes or challenges that you've noticed?
That's a good question. When I was preparing for this, I was like, okay, let me get a good example of things, in advertising, and not necessarily the bad examples, but, I think there's something to be said for finding something that's relatable, that gets people to understand, and being way too personal, even in social media. Sometimes I see my cohorts and they're out there and they're putting things out there that are just way too personal, that probably, aren't as relatable, or it's kind of that TMI effect, like, I don't need to know that, and how is this going to help your business,
right,
kind of thing. So I think there's a fine line there of what's appropriate and what's not. I will tell you the thing that I did come across and that I remembered, you might recall a few years back, think Super Bowl commercials, right? These are always my favorite. This is why I got into the advertising business.
Classic, yeah. Super Bowl commercials are great to analyze, yeah.
Yes, I love them. And they're so creative, and it really gives the producers behind the scenes, the opportunity to do some great storytelling and to connect with the audience, by way of humor or whatever the case may be, some sort of emotion. So think back about 5 years, and, Budweiser is always, having ads in the Super Bowl. And there was one in particular that they used the concept of the hero and his journey. So there was a moment where the Clydesdales were on a farm, right? And then there was this puppy, this dog that befriended one of the Clydesdales. And I don't know if you remember this, but then he went off. I think he got adopted somewhere else. And then years later, he found his way back to the Clydesdales. And everybody was just like, oh, it was this lost puppy, and he came back. And I think everybody related to it. It wasn't even your typical comical relief, comedy relief during the Super Bowl, but that emotion, right? It pulled at the heartstrings, and everybody, male, female, all of the above, it's like, okay, I love this. Okay, who's this for? It's for Budweiser. Let me go grab a Bud Light or whatever you're drinking, Yep. But I thought that was really, really well done when it came to storytelling. And I thought that would be a nice example to share here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember that one. And I'm not somebody who watches a ton of commercials or analyzes, certainly not to the extent that you do. But even I remember that, right? And the emotions associated with that. So that, it just goes to show thinking creatively about how you're delivering the information really makes such a difference. And we've talked about this before. And next week, in the webinar that we're going to be doing next week, we're going to go a little bit more into emotional language and how to actually incorporate that into a presentation. But it's all connected, right? I mean, so when you look at a very kind of heartwarming commercial like that, you think to yourself, okay, what are they doing? What's the impact that they're trying to create there? Essentially what they're doing is giving the brand an identity, giving the brand some kind of association, so that people have a positive association, positive feeling with that brand, right? And so if people have a positive association, then they're more likely to purchase. So thinking on the psychology and how you can influence the audience in that way also makes a big difference.
Sure. Now I have a question for you, because again, you're the coach about all of these things, all these great things. And I want to know, okay, so if we're telling stories, if we're presenters, if we're telling stories and they're personal stories, they're usually about us or something that we witnessed. How do you flip the narrative so then your audience can relate and say, you know what? Yes, I can see myself in that position, because we always want it to be about them. Right? That's like, especially in advertising, that's the number one rule. You don't write an about me page. You write, okay, here's how you can benefit by using my services, right? So in a presentation, how do you flip that narrative and telling a story so to make it about them, make it about your audience?
So one thing we've talked before about just researching and understanding your audience, right? Understanding their needs, goals, desires, values, what are their assumptions and priorities going into the presentation. So that gives you some insight, because then you can figure out, okay, out of all of the stories that I could potentially tell, which of these that I can pick out are most relevant and have the biggest direct connection to my audience, given their assumptions and their goals and their needs, right? Mm-hmm. I also think that when you get a little bit vulnerable and you share your personal challenges or successes, that is something that even if somebody has not literally been in that situation, they can still connect with, So for example, like if I talk about my past experience with stage fright or being nervous when I was first few times that I got in front of a crowd of people to speak, that's something that is fairly universal. And even if someone has not specifically experienced that, they will be able to resonate with it, because we've all experienced nervousness. We've all experienced that fight or flight reaction and the physiological reaction that happens in the body. Let's say it's like a job interview situation. Now, I myself have not had, I've mostly worked for myself and run my own businesses for most of my career, but so I haven't been in those kind of high stakes job interview situations. But if someone was describing that, the sweaty palms, the nervousness, heart rate increasing, your voice becoming weaker, all that type of thing, that's something that will resonate with me. I can understand that because I've had those similar kinds of experiences. So that's another thing to keep in mind as far as the personal aspect.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I feel like there's something to be said for authenticity. I feel like it brings authenticity to the presentation. Anybody can spout off, some great theories or processes or actions to take or numbers, you know, what have you. But at the end of the day, you know, injecting those personal stories, I think that really brings it back. Like, okay, I'm not just regurgitating information that I researched, you know, or that anybody can say. I'm now showing you how I put this in action or how this applied to me and therefore how it can apply to you. Let me ask you, what if you have a mixed audience? What if it's all levels, junior and senior? How do you find that balance in your presentations when you're doing storytelling?
I would say, you know, is there some characteristic that unites all of them? So for example, there may be a diversity or a variety in ages or in titles or seniority, but maybe everybody is within a particular niche community within your industry, for example. So that becomes the main thing. Like for example, product development, you know, whether someone is more senior or more junior, within product development, there's a lot of common universal themes that everyone will resonate with. Also, think about if it's really, like if you can identify two major blocks, let's say that you have a group of VPs and SVPs, and that's 40% of the room, and then 60% of the room is entry-level people in that particular field. So then you can speak to both. I mean, hopefully you have experience and enough expertise that relates to both of them, right? But you can incorporate stories that relate to both of those types of individuals, right? So, you know, you don't have to be a one-trick pony. You don't have to limit yourself in that sense. You can have multiple stories. You can literally say, for those of you who are more junior, this is what you're probably going to be facing in the next few years. For those of you in the room who have been in the industry for 5, 10 plus years, this is something that you will resonate with. You will remember that when you first started out, blah, 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 right? So that type of thing can be very effective too.
Sure. So we've got a couple of questions here from, I don't know if it's Joan or Joanne, but
Joanne, Joanne is joining us.
Oh, fabulous. Okay. So Joanne asked, how do you feel about having a hero in your story during a presentation? And then do you have a suggestion for incorporating the hero into your presentation? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So the hero can be you yourself, right? Depending on the type of information that you're trying to convey or the types of events. The hero can be sometimes your CEO, or another senior executive, which can be good if that person is actually in the room and you're actually presenting in front of that person. But also, even if they're not in the room, that individual may be like a mini celebrity within your organization. And so everybody in the organization is familiar with that person and their story and what their priorities are, et cetera. So that can be a very effective tactic. Also, sometimes the hero is the customer or the client or the user. And, you know, for example, in a product development context, there is so much focus on the end user and what the user needs. So the user becomes the hero. And so we tell a story around the user experience, what they need, what they are, challenges that they're facing, et cetera. And what do you think about that, Julie, about the concept of the hero? I know you touched on that a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely an effective strategy to use. You know, I'm certainly not against it by any stretch of the imagination. You know, I feel like as long as you keep it realistic and don't make it overarching so people can't relate with it, I think it's just fine.
Yeah. Yeah, always, like we mentioned, always bring it back to the practical application, right? And I think you made a great point on that, Julie. Mike, thanks a lot for coming. Appreciate it. See you soon. But yeah, Julie, you made a great point on that as far as making it practical and pragmatic, making sure that it's not so super personal, making sure that it's not super disconnected from the actual business at hand. Always thinking, what is the implication? How to bring this back to something that is tangible and useful for the audience. I think that's a great way to wrap it up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you know, to bring it back to that story that I shared earlier about my mom saying, drop what you're doing, run to the grocery store because there's a meat sale. You know, I think I became the hero of my own story because I was showing people what I did and how I set the boundaries with my own mother, right? And I think people were able to relate to that because it was a personal story that they could understand and have empathy for.
Yeah, exactly. I think we're good for today, so we're going to leave it there. And thanks a lot for joining again, and we'll see you next time.